Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of the 451 Alliance webinar series. Today's presentation covers Workforce Productivity and Collaboration, or WPC as it's known. The webinar is entitled Understanding IT's Goals and the Role of Digital Workplace Technologies in the New Future of Work. My name is Andrew Cranen. I'm a membership manager for the 451 Alliance, and I want to first sincerely thank you for attending today's presentation. It's the participation of you, our Alliance members, in our quantitative surveys and qualitative interviews that provides the rich end-user insights that lay the foundation for the knowledge we're able to deliver to you through our reporting and our webinars. And presenting today is Mr. Chris Marsh. Chris is the research director for the WPC practice here at 451 Research. He's based in San Francisco. Good morning, Chris. Great to have you with us, and take it away.
Great, thanks, Andrew, and hello, everyone. Thank you for your time today. Just to sort of re-emphasize, echo Andrew's point that we're all very thankful for your participation in our surveys. I know all analysts here think the same, and of course, we'll be using much of that data today in the presentation. So, pretty self-explanatory per the title for this session. What we'll be talking about, we'll really be talking about, IT's changing role in the digital workplace, how they manage the digital workplace, how they think and strategize around it. We have a whole bunch of things going on, the combination of ongoing digital transformations, impacts from the pandemic, crises in supply chains, energy prices, the cost of living, along with sort of generally longitudinally rising expectations from employees around what their experience at work is like. And you put all of that together, it's really radically altering, I think, how technologists need to think about how they equip their workforces with not just technologies, but policies and practices and best practices that can shape how they get their work done. We see things like workforce alignment, business resilience, talent management, skills mobility, culture engagement. All of these things now feel more important than even a few years ago. And so that this webinar will explore these shifts. It will point to some of the things to consider as organizations try and align their business and technology transformations. The intention here is not death by PowerPoint. I think I only have 8 or 9 slides that I'm going to go over, and I'm going to try and go over them fairly quickly so that we have time for Q&A. So again, to Andrew's point, if you have questions as we're going through this, please feel free to submit them through the console, and we'll try and get to them. And if we can't get to them in this session, either for time reasons or because I'm not the particular subject matter expert to answer your question, then we'll make sure that someone in my team or another team can follow up after the fact. So let's get into this conversation then. I mean, I think maybe the most macro point I'll be making through this session is really that optimizing the digital workplace is about more than just managing productivity and collaboration tools. It's more than just, managing core business systems. I think it has to be viewed, and increasingly is being viewed, certainly by the more digitally progressive organizations, in a much wider lens of the employee experience, or the EX, which is what I'm showing here. There are different ways to think about the EX, what it's constituted by. In our conception of it, it has these 4 pillars that you can see on the visual. It has, everything company values, the sort of brand appeal, the day-to-day company culture. And I'll be talking a little bit more about distinctions between company culture and operational culture later on. And then there's the sort of second pillar of personal development, skilling, career potential, the degree to which employees think that they can advance their career and their organization. And then you have the sort of third pillar of everything, compensation, benefits, and recognition. And then finally, you have what we call the work execution culture, which is really the tools, the systems, the practices, the behaviors that determine how work is actually done, how it's executed across teams, across divisions within a company. And, we very purposefully place that work execution culture at the heart of the employee experience. That's why we have it in the middle of the other pillars. More of the employee experience is really being mediated by technology, and it has consequent impacts, not just on productivity, but on a whole host of other business outcomes, as I'm sure you're experiencing and having conversations around within your own organizations. So many of those outcomes are very hot button issues right now: talent attraction, talent retention, skills mobility, business agility, business resilience, innovation, even purpose. To what degree is it important to have a certain technology experience within a certain employee experience that can help shape either the purpose of the organization itself or the purpose that individual employees feel as they undertake their role, as they go about their day-to-day work. And so, managing the digital workplace, I think, is increasingly a matter of managing the employee experience. And with it, we're certainly seeing closer collaborations. I mean, you're telling us this through the surveys that we do, closer collaborations between IT and HR and operations teams, that they're happening, and also with other lines of business, maybe a more tangible, ongoing conversation with business leaders to understand, what are the specifics of their teams, what they need, how they need to work, and how you can equip them in being successful. And really, here's some evidence to substantiate why taking an employee experience lens is important. And this is actually taken from a regression analysis we did on the data from one of our employee surveys. So we run a dedicated employee engagement survey at the end of every year. So this is data from the last time we did this in sort of December, January this year, where we really dig deep into the different drivers and barriers to engagement, like what makes an engaged employee, what do they think is important, what is an impediment to them feeling more content and engaged in their role. It's a super interesting survey. And, we have a whole bunch of different questions that go in that survey and variables that we look at. And we decided the last time we did this, how can we sort of cut through the noise, as it were, and actually try and distinguish what is really driving positive engagement. And so from around 50 different variables, the 7 that I'm showing here came out as statistically significant drivers. It's like the top drivers of positive engagement. We could do, and I have done, whole webinars just on this data, but obviously the 2nd and the 7th, I think, should be of particular interest, right? So that the first sort of strongest driver is, there are opportunities for me to grow at work. Employees want to think that where they are gives them an opportunity to pick up new skills, to advance their careers, to get the promotions, to see a future there. But second place is, my organization provides me with the tools and technologies that I need to succeed, right? So again, just to re-emphasize that, the tools and technologies you equip your employees with are some of the most statistically strong drivers of your workforce's overall engagement. And you'll note that even though it was a variable that we included in this survey, compensation isn't here. It just fell off off the bottom of this list. So if we look at this, it's opportunity. I want to know that there's opportunity where I work. It's belonging and purpose. I want to know that, the organization I work for is an organization I respect. I want to feel some sense of belonging here. That can differ very differently employee by employee, but increasingly employees want a sense of belonging and purpose. And it's most certainly about technologies. It's increasingly the case that the technology experience within an organization determines, to a large part, engagement and lots of those other business outcomes that flow from either positive or negative engagement. We're seeing, really interesting data amongst our employee surveys along the lines of, if there was a much better technology stack that was available in another company, then, a significant proportion, I think it's about a third of all employees say that they would leave their current organization and work somewhere else if it was deemed that there were better technologies deployed across the workforce in that new organization that would give them a more satisfying, less frictionful day-to-day experience. So this is highly consequential. It's becoming more so. And I think it really raises the significance and the stakes of your digital workplace technology strategies. And I think increasingly leadership will expect these new outcomes. Again, this is something that you're telling us in the surveys. Leadership wants that conversation, and they want to have a better sense of cause and effect between, investments you might be making in technologies you deploy to your employees and business outcomes that they might want to expect. And I think increasingly we're seeing the urgency around those conversations and, some sense of accountability wanting to be had around, how those investments can directly lead to specific business outcomes that maybe haven't traditionally, and still for a lot of companies aren't really felt to be within the remit of IT teams and digital workplace teams. So, technology is a driver of engagement, and engagement impacts a whole host of important things, which is really what we see here. Belonging was another of those key drivers, if you remember from that previous slide. More engaged employees are unsurprisingly 5 times more likely to feel a strong sense of belonging in their organization than those feeling disengaged. They're even, twice as likely as those feeling somewhat engaged to have a sense of belonging or feel a sense of purpose in their role. Employees who feel very engaged are more likely to be invested in their own career development in their organization. They're more likely to be thinking about what opportunities they want to seize to progress in their career. They're also more likely to feel a sense of purpose, to be learning new skills and learning new skills more quickly. They are less likely to be tempted to leave their current organization by the opportunity of a salary increase at another organization if they're feeling very engaged. And so, technology experiences obviously don't account for all of what drives that engagement amongst that sort of highest cohort of engaged workers. But as we saw on the previous slide, it is a huge determinant. It is that second strongest driver overall of positive engagement. Leadership are starting to want to understand that relationship much more so, much more granular and much more tangibly than has historically been the case in most companies. And, there therefore needs to be, intentional cause and effect stretching out from the specific investments you're making in digital workplace technologies and, other outcomes that are driven, other outcomes that are sort of encapsulating, positive engagement drivers amongst your employees. And so I would say for some digital workplace teams, this means that they need to raise their gaze a little. The range and weight of business drivers behind technology choices is growing. And for many digital workplace teams, more strategic, more intentional, and more concerted thought will need to be put behind this. Now, of course, you are not a homogenous group. We know that clearly from surveys and all the data we analyze that you give us. There are digital leaders who are quite a far ahead in that journey, who are technology progressive, who are paying much more attention in their strategy and execution to, business drivers and intended business outcomes. There are at the other end, those that are, slower on this digital transformation curve and, who haven't prioritized workforce transformation as much as some other companies have done. So, it's a challenging environment. We all know this. There's lots of sort of impediments to increasing productivity and efficiency and engagement across a company. We all know this after 2.5 turbulent years in particular. But in fact, before the pandemic, it was also the case as, companies were trying to figure out their digital transformations, where workforce transformation fits in with that and what manner it should take. In fact, really interestingly, and I often talk about this, in webinars. About 3 or 4 years before 2020, we saw blip on the radar, again from data that you've been giving us that we've been tracking longitudinally. Improving the workforce productivity and collaboration experience had risen up the IT-led transformation agenda within organizations. Prior to that, it had languished sort of bottom table, mid-table. But around 2016, 2017, we really saw this rise up the agenda. And I think it was because, increasingly there was the feeling that, there was too much friction around a growing number of application silos that was actually summing up into real problems with strategic execution. Teams were not able to create workflows that they need to. There was too much noise, too much context switching, all of those things that I think most of us are familiar with. And so, for a good, 5, 6, 7 years, it has sort of, in a general sense, begun to be prioritized much more as a transformation priority. But of course, we do have this pretty unique context that subsequently happened over the past couple of years, and lots of challenges that exist out there, which is what this visual is showing. I think our data points to definitely a more remote/hybrid future in terms of where employees are working. That debate continues to rage. I think actually in particular over the past couple of months, it's sort of come back on the agenda as we phase out of the pandemic and as companies are having to decide on what that longer term policy is around in-office work or hybrid or remote. Certainly the preference that we see from employees in our employee surveys from the majority of employees is that they want a mix. They don't want to be on site as much as they used to be doing before the pandemic. And I think more companies have become permissive to it. That's certainly what the data shows. But obviously with that come a whole host of challenges. We know that, again, looking at the data that you give us through our surveys, business technologists are concerned with how to support work-life balances, how to prevent burnout, how to ensure that teams can be focused and aligned. A third are specifically worried about having the right technologies to support remote work. That's what you've been telling us. And about a quarter of you say that getting buy-in for a strategy to address it is also a key challenge. I would argue that all of these challenges can have technology answers to them that can help mitigate the downsides. It's certainly important to understand this context, though. Again, before 2020, I think work was pretty challenging, lots of friction, growing numbers of application silos, maybe not as much strategic thoughts beyond specific technology choices about what the operational culture, again, as distinct from company culture, looks like, what an optimally performing workforce can look like, and what role digital workplace technologies play in wider employee experience strategies. I think the difference from 2 years ago, however, is that the stakes are higher. The relationship between employer and employee is changing. The pendulum always swings one way then the other, but I think it's difficult not to see in the longer term view the pendulum not swinging towards employees. Their expectations are rising. The labour market is still is more volatile now than it was. Expectations around technology experiences are ever increasing, of course, informed by what we personal lives. And, more rests on getting this right than did in the past. And so, in short, I think it should be the key transformation priority to get this right. And I'd say there are really 3 main areas to focus on. And we'll look at each of these over these last 3 slides before we seg into Q&A. So the first area I would say, and again, we could spend whole webinars talking about each of these individual issues, trying here to give a sort of more macro perspective around what are those big buckets of challenges that we see impacting those making decisions around digital workplace strategies. I think the first area really is addressing the very fragmented, disconnected, sprawling experience that most employees have across the different applications they need to use. For many organizations, this estate of different apps continues to grow. And as you can see by the call-out text box on the right, and this is data from our employee survey, 2/3 of employees state that among the biggest technology challenges that's impeding their own personal performance are, struggles with fragmentation, essentially. It's information silos, data silos, the lack of integration between applications. It's, challenges in collaborating across applications with different people. It's having too many niche apps that don't do enough really of what employees want them to do. So they're having to try and string together, a sort of whole ecosystem of different applications. I'll provide a bit of a macro perspective here to begin to think about how to address this. I mean, we came to the conclusion, I would say, a couple of years ago, that really we've come to the end of the first era of SaaS. We've had 20 years of SaaS. And, that era was one where pretty remorselessly the debate was, a best of breed one focused on functional distinctiveness, right? The sort of general view was that you choose your best messaging app, the best content collaboration app, the best intranet, the best project management tool, etc. And the IT's job was to sort of, choose the best version of what they thought was the best version, and connect them all through APIs if there was demand to do that, or not, and let employees figure it out. And that worked only to an extent. It left us with, lots of silos and all of the friction that has forced companies to take this as more of a transformation priority, actually fixing it. And I think we've detected over the past couple of years that we're entering a second era for SaaS. We spend a lot of our time, of course, speaking to technology vendors. We spend, I would say, most of our time speaking to, vendors who are offering different solutions, trying to understand, what they're positioning to, what they see as the opportunity, and obviously having an interesting conversation around that. And, increasingly we're seeing, positioning marked more by the integration of different capabilities into more singular kinds of experience, where IT will need to make more intentional and strategic judgment calls on, which apps are strategic, which are tactical, right? Which is the hub, which are the spokes? What does that ecosystem around, the sort of work destinations looks like? What does the experience look like across those technologies? And, three things I think need to be balanced as you try and architect that estate to provide that more seamless experience for the employees. And these three things, the secret sauce, of course, is to keep them in balance. So the first one is, giving your workforce the technologies that provide or support the maximum operational agility. Right, so agility in terms of how data and information can move across your teams, through your apps, how your teams can plan their work, agility in terms of process creation and process management, and also in terms of like resource management, capacity planning. I think the second thing is, technologies that provide the maximum autonomy to more people to do those things. Right. So how do you democratize, things like process creation? Is that low and no code? How do you do that around, project planning and resource management? Is that some kind of work management technology that is, maybe more flexible and scalable than some of the traditional PPM kinds of tooling? There could be, lots of different ways and perspectives in terms of how you judge, empowerment of teams at the edge of the company. With the ability to do higher order kinds of things. And then finally, tools that allow your teams to stay aligned, because no one wants a Wild West. That's been a big concern of companies as they've looked at some of these sort of land and expand tools. How do you make sure there's alignment, across teams where that needs to be the case, certainly back to goals, to compliance, to governance frameworks, to security requirements. No one wants that Wild West, but they do want focus and alignment. So really, as you think about how to grapple with this application sprawl and all the friction that comes with it, I would say try and think about your technology investments, your technology strategy with those three things in mind. How do you get the best balance between optimal operational agility, between autonomy for your employees to do things in their tools and alignment so that you know that that is not going to create, that autonomy is not going to create problems further down the line. I think expecting those things to naturally happen, it won't. They won't either be the product of individual technology choices, expecting them to happen when you're thinking features and function more so than experience, I think is not going to end well either. We are in an experience economy. For customers, we're used to thinking in that way, maybe less so for the workforce and employees, but it is increasingly so. And, experiences, of course, are more than just an aggregate of individual technology choices. There needs to be a strategic architecture with the vision of that seamless experience for employees baked into it. And so the second of these three big areas that, as you reflect on your strategies, it may be worth thinking about is really the gap between strategy and execution that, in most organizations exists very strongly. A company sets out with a set of goals, expects those to cascade downwards into business teams and end up in aligned delivery at the kind of localized level. Of course, that frequently doesn't happen. That's stating the obvious. The past 20 years of SaaS has made that very challenging. The more silos you have, the more falls between the gaps, the harder visibility and alignment are, the more challenging focus is. And the SaaS sprawl has ended up a little bit like Chinese whispers. One thing is said at the start, and then it's interpreted or ends up being executed on very differently at the end. Of course, none of this is knocking SaaS, the SaaS era. It's, of course, been a huge net benefit. But I think we do need to be realistic about the balance of pros and cons so that, strategies can be more realistic going forward. And as you can see on this with this data, there are plenty of things that you're telling us that stifle sort of strategic planning. Some are related to actual, strategy formation, the creation of plans in the first instance. Some of them, though, are problems of execution. I think all are a product, arguably, of a lack of real-time tracking, real-time decision-making, the lack of a base in data on which to make decisions. And this is part of the reason why coming out of the pandemic, we're seeing tailwinds behind and a sort of resurgence behind top-down approaches. Of course, a lot of the SaaS era has, certainly in a productivity and collaboration, employee engagement technology sense, has been more of a bottoms-up movement. But I think tailwinds coming out of the pandemic behind some top-down approaches. So we see more interest in things like strategic portfolio management. We see new spins around enterprise architecture. We see, really strong tailwinds behind more agile and connected planning, where you have finance, FP&A teams, and strategic planning teams in a closer exchange and nearer real-time exchange with business teams. It's also why we see more companies want a direct line of sight in their workflows and how they think about their estate of workflows and business processes, and with their goal setting and data from strategic goals to be more localized execution. And business agility, resilience, all of those things that have been companies have had a shock around the past couple of years, really rely on closing this between strategy and execution. And so there's a whole bunch of questions here. If you have a PMO, is it working? Is it agile and engaging with business teams, or is it more of an ivory tower? Portfolio level capabilities, how good are you at engaging and creating and sustaining ongoing conversations between technical teams, business owners, service owners? How much visibility do you have into your overall architecture of tools, not just from a cost standpoint, but from a value stream angle? And plenty of other questions that go into that mix. But I think as we move forward over the next 3 years and beyond, we're going to see increasing focus from IT and from digital workplace teams on figuring out, what are the levers we want to pull here to actually close this gap so that we have more predictability in terms of what is actually executed against vis-a-vis the plans that we put in place previously. And then I would say that the final main challenge that you need to think about is really data. This is hitting workforce transformations later than it has done customer experience transformations, where there is significantly more maturity around data management, analytics, and intelligence as part of the CX technology stack. Nevertheless, it's coming as it's almost the driver and the result of addressing the previous two challenges. Right? More seamless experiences require a better appreciation of how data and information flows across applications, across teams. But seamless experiences also should themselves create higher quality data to use, more unified data, more contextualized data. Equally, how companies close that gap between strategy and execution, and their success in doing so will be because they've figured out, largely will be because they've figured out how data flows across their teams, across their different systems, so that they can cause and effect in terms of how they continue to close that gap and get the outcomes that they're intending towards. As the data in this visual shows, that the most significant benefit from being more data-driven is deemed to be improving business agility, business processes. 41% say it's the ability to empower decision makers, right? So this is data from the surveys that you've helped us with on the data analytics, data management side. Really interestingly, from our employee surveys, when we specifically asked them about their interest in having workforce analytics at their disposal, or having more of their work informed by data-based analytics. The interesting news is that the level of comfort with their organization monitoring their activities on work provision devices and work apps, if it was to recommend productivity improvements, is actually pretty high. So this is one of the questions we ask employees. 52%, actually 53% say they're very comfortable with their company doing that. Percent say they're somewhat comfortable with them doing that. So you put those two things together, you've basically got 85% of employees who say, I'm okay if you monitor what I'm doing on work devices and apps. If the goal is to recommend improvements to how my team operates, how I can be more personally productive, it's only 15% who say, I don't really want you to be doing that. We then, in the employee survey, dig into, okay, so if you had that kind of analytics, what would be the top use cases for you when it comes to, improving your own personal performance? And basically what they say is, number one, having more insights into top performing employees. What are their skills? What are their experience? What can I learn from that? Number two is, can you tell me more about how much time I'm spending on different tasks? Not always clear to me, where I'm putting the weight of my time. I need to be more efficient in understanding that so that I can, rebalance if that's required. And then the third main use case where employees say, I would love more, more of a database way to understand this is performance against goals, right? So give me the actual basis to understand where I am vis-a-vis goals, how I'm performing, and of course, they want to know that in order to make changes to improve. So I would say this is a fairly new frontier. It's one that will become more important, though, to be more opinionated about. So hopefully that was some useful food for thought. Again, in any one of those issues, we could have talked for a whole separate hour about it, but hopefully that gives you sort of like a sort of macro perspective around, what you're telling us through the surveys, what our employee respondents are telling us through the employee surveys. There's so much more we could have said. We have 4 analysts just in my team, and we have 4 separate primary surveys that we actually do amongst employees, amongst yourselves, amongst HR professionals, amongst company leadership. And that really allows us to understand this space. But if you have any questions now, please feel free to ask them. And again, if it's a question that's not my particular subject matter expertise, we'll of course route it to one who can answer it to get back to you after the fact. But Andrew, maybe you want to open up the Q&A. Let me know if anything's come through.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for those great WPC insights. Really, really great stuff. So we do have some time and some questions to field. Here is the first, Chris. An audience member asks, is there an ideal tenure at an organization? Do we need to strive to retain employees for, say, 4 or 8 years, and then cycle in new employees to ensure new innovative thinking and keep the organization fresh?
And I am immediately recalling some data in some of our different surveys. I mean, I don't think there is an ideal tenure at an organization, and of course, it's going to depend on the type of organization, the type of role, also, the demographics of particular employees, how old they are, how young they are, what skills they have, what kind of role they're performing. So I wouldn't say there's an ideal tenure. I do, though, think that, companies at the moment are particularly concerned about attrition, right? They're coming out of the pandemic, we're having experienced a lot of operational volatility. The war for talent in some ways has intensified. And, companies are really concerned about getting, retaining employees, retaining top talent, having the processes that allow them to do that. And, one of the things that I think they're, as part of that, particularly focused on, and we see this through our HR surveys and through some of the surveys we do amongst company leadership, is, getting employees off to a good start. We have a really interesting question in our employee surveys where we ask both sort of recent hires, so those in our surveys who are recent hires into whatever company they work for, and amongst managers, that basically ask them how quick they think it takes them to start delivering value in their role. And I think the average is something like 6 months, or the median lies between, I think, 6 months and sort of 9 months, which is quite a long time. And there is a definite strong correlation between the amount of time it takes someone to deliver value and how long they are retained in their role before they move on to do something else in a different organization. I.e., if you get off the ground running really quickly and you have onboarding processes and technologists that support a really good onboarding of a new employee, then you can actually trace that longitudinally to higher, sort of longer retention further down the line. So, as companies think about that, they're really focused a lot at the moment on that, getting their new employees off to a good start. We also see, just coming out of the pandemic, a big focus on skilling, right? There's lots more talk than there used to be sort of 5-6 years ago around internal mobility, right? If we can't go out and find new employees as easily, or it's really expensive for us to do that, then we need to have a strategy that allows us to, continually skill our workforce, and, allow more internal mobility within the organization so that people can move around roles rather than just saying, well, as a company, we don't allow that. So the only option for someone who isn't satisfied in their role is to leave the organization. So I don't think there is an ideal tenure. But we certainly know that it's a much bigger, more strategic issue for companies to retain talent at the moment. And again, that's another reason why they need to take more of an employee experience and employee lifecycle lens to their technology strategies, because understanding the friction, the pain points at each stage of an employee's journey is obviously going to give you a better chance of retaining talent where you want to.
That's great. Thank you. There is another question that makes reference to a particular slide that I have brought back up. It's slide number 4. The question reads, slide 4 seems to imply that employees want stability at the work environment and that they want an environment where they can stay for some time. But this seems to be counter to the current employee movements out of organizations. Can you comment on that? What are your thoughts here?
I mean, I think employees want, increasingly they want to feel a sense of belonging and purpose. If they don't, if you're a talented member of the workforce and you're not getting those things, then you will leave. But I think what we do see amongst companies who really do prioritize that, who, work hard on, providing a good experience for their employees, that, an organization in which there is, mechanisms to drive engagement and create a sense of belonging, and allow employees to develop their own sense of purpose within that organization, which of course is going to differ employee by employee, then they do have stronger retention. So, again, interestingly on this data, compensation, it of course, is a big part of the mix for all employees, certainly for most employees. That goes without saying, but it did drop off the bottom of this list. So, insofar as the interpretation of this data can say, employees really do want a sense of belonging, a sense of connectedness with their company. They don't just want a day job where they clock in and clock out. Then yes, I think that is something that is trending upwards. But again, employees are not shy about saying, I'm not getting that here, so I'm going to leave and go somewhere else.
Very good. Tell us how employee engagement levels changed over the course of the pandemic and where it stands right now.
Yeah, so it splintered really early on, actually. I recall data that we gathered at the end of 2020, and we've, more than once a year gauged this in our different surveys up until recently. And, if my memory serves me, around a quarter or so said that they felt actually more engaged. And a lot of those were those that just preferred remote working and maybe just didn't want to go into the office before. And about the same there or thereabouts, if I recall, said that they actually felt less engaged in their role. They didn't like, maybe the different strains and stresses they were experiencing, how their company was having to pivot, maybe furloughs had a role there. Maybe they didn't like enforced remote work when there were lockdowns. And I would say that polarization has continued mostly through to now, albeit I think with a slightly lower proportion in the last time we gauged this in our surveys, who said they felt disengaged. But that polarization does still exist, which is a big problem. And so a lot hinges on policies businesses are making right now about the return to the office, about what technologies they're using to support, hybrid working styles, and around what their talent and compensation strategies are as employees look at their different options. I would say beyond that sort of polarization that does still exist, like more, some people that say, actually, I'm more engaged now, this worked out in my favor, and the cohort at the other end who are saying, actually, I still feel disengaged, this hasn't worked, for me. The devil is really in the detail, and we spent some time pulling that apart as we're looking at the data. So, surprise, surprise, those that had prior experience of working remotely before 2020 feel more positive now than those that didn't really have much experience at all and have struggled with figuring out how to adapt to it. Those teams and those individuals who really feel as though they have a good level of autonomy in their role are very significantly more likely to say they're more engaged now than before. Very interestingly to me, frontline workers, so those, the majority of the workforce operates in some kind of frontline worker role. I think sometimes we forget that, but if you, include all the different kinds of frontline worker roles from, those working in the healthcare profession to, road warriors and the sales force and the field force and all of the others that essentially don't work the majority of their time on a fixed site. Frontline workers are more engaged now and much more likely to be more engaged now than those who don't work in a frontline role. Those that work for companies with progressive technology strategies versus those that aren't early adopters, that are always very conservative with technology adoption. Those in those more progressive organizations are more likely to feel more engaged now. Millennials are much more likely to feel more engaged now than boomers. And so, yeah, the devil's in the detail, but in a broad sense, that polarization still exists. There is still a big cohort of employees who feel disengaged. And so this is one of the key challenges, of course, that companies have to figure out. How do you think about your digital workplace strategy, both technology and policy process, when you have essentially a more heterogeneous environment in terms of what different employees want, what different working styles you're going to have to figure out how to support, and that detail around just different groups of workers finding it harder than others. There is the potential to really get that wrong and to drive further division if it feels as though there isn't an equitable experience that's being created. And I think that is, if I'm honest, a large part of what's behind a lot of larger companies' leadership saying you have to get back into the office, because that is really difficult thinking that has to be done. And I think some companies don't want to do that thinking.
Are employees, do you think, feeling more empowered by or more frustrated by the technology they use to maintain a remote and distributed workforce?
That's a good question. I mean, it's one of those questions that sort of, it depends sort of answer. It depends on what new technologies, if anything, has been deployed to support more remote working. Some companies, have actually gone full bore into researching and thinking about, what different kinds of technology are more suited to extended remote working. There's been a big bump in sort of virtual whiteboarding tools, which prior to the pandemic were relatively niche, but which have really found a solid footing as a sort of new collaboration environment. So rather than just having people constantly on conferencing calls and messaging apps, why don't we get them into a richer, more immersive visual environment where you can have, more purposeful, more structured kinds of conversation collaboration. So that's one example of the kinds of technologies that more progressive kinds of companies have looked at to support sort of remote and hybrid working. I think lots of companies, though, haven't done that. Lots of companies are relying on, conferencing tools. We all know which those tools are. And certainly what we found during the pandemic, and I think what we still find in our employee surveys, is that has been actually just the wrong thing. I mean, actually, before the pandemic, before sort of mass remote working, in our employee surveys, we used to ask, if there's one thing that could happen to allow you to be more productive and happier in your role, what would it be? And the answer resoundingly from the surveys was having more time to focus doing solo work, not distracted by conversation. And of course, what happened when we all shifted to remote work, everyone was having more conversations. And so it depends. I mean, there are lots of new kinds of technologies and lots of existing technologies that have been, that companies are, thinking about how to leverage to support remote work. I think, that's going to help drive engagement for those companies that thinks that, it's primarily getting people to Zoom into Teams and that's problem solved. I think the data isn't showing that to be the case.
Good. Chris, you used the term operational culture. What do you mean by that term?
Yeah, so I specifically distinguish it from company culture, which has more to do with, company values, HR policies. It's the sort of tacit social order of a company. Operational culture in contrast, and I suppose in complement, because I suspect it will become a subset of how we think about wider company cultural issues. It focuses more on the combination of policies and practices and technologies that specifically define how work happens across your organization. So that could be, determined policies around remote, in-person, hybrid, and the technology choices to match to that. We just talked about that a little bit. Maybe some teams are practitioners of agile or scaled agile or another framework, and there are technologies that may match that. Some companies have an innovation platform where they allow a workforce to engage and submit ideas to company or divisional problems, right? So there's a sort of crowdsourcing element to it. Maybe some companies have a 20% rule like Google did, where employees are allowed part of their time to sort of solo problem solve their way to address company issues. Maybe workforce analytics is used to understand productivity behaviors. There's lots of considerations that guide planning. Are you operating in a more centralized model or in a more distributed model, right? There's a lot that could go into defining what operational culture is, but historically, most companies have not actually been that joined up about it, right? There hasn't really been anyone that's dedicated to architecting, documenting, and communicating what that operational culture actually is. But that has become much more important now. And, as we've already seen, and again, as you're telling us in our surveys, IT is working more closely now with HR, with operations and other teams to try and move towards giving more clarity around how they want the company to actually operate and what the principles and technologies and practices are that define it. So very, very distinct from company culture, but something that it sometimes gets mixed up with.
That's great. Thank you. Folks, that brings us to the end of today's presentation. And thank you again, Chris. And a very big thank you as well to all of you for joining us today and for continuing to contribute your voice and your insights to 451 Alliance research. Another reminder to please watch for the recording of this webinar and the slide deck, which will be emailed to all 451 Alliance members tomorrow. If you have questions for us here, please do reach out by email at 451alliance@451alliance.com. Or you can follow us on Twitter at 451alliance. We do hope you found this presentation useful today and that you can join us for future 451 Alliance studies and webinars. Thank you again for your continued membership and your study participation. Folks, please enjoy the balance of the summer safely, and goodbye for now. Thank you again, Chris.
Pleasure. Thanks again, everyone.